Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of the Asian American Teen Podcast, where we explore the deepest and most important moments in the history of Asians in America. I'm your host, Jack, from the Bittermelon, and we are so happy to be working in collaboration with the Austining Public Library, who has graciously let us use their recording space and materials today. I'm here with my co host as well, Amy. Take it away.
Hey guys, I'm so excited to be here to discuss this first episode with you. So, to keep you guys in the loop, I'm just going to give you the general outline of what we're going to talk about, and we can go from there. So, today, for the first episode, we're going to talk about the First Immigration Restriction Act, the Page Act of 1875. We'll go over the basic backgrounds, Asian threats, government intervention, the goals of the United States, and lastly, the most important part, in my opinion, the impact of the act. Thanks for coming. All right, so to get this ball rolling, let's talk just about the general background of the Page Act and why it occurred. So, immigrants began arriving in the United States in the 1850s with the promise of a golden America. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the phrase, like, the roads were paved with gold. And during this time, there was things like the gold rush that were attracting immigrants to come to America in hopes of a better life. But another thing that's really important to mention is the fact that there were a lot of misleading labor contracts. So people who were working for railroads wanted cheap or like almost free labor. So they would go to China or other Asian countries. They'd promise good wages and good hours just to get them to come to America to work for them. However, the reality was that it was very harsh. They were grueling, cruel hours at the railroads. Asian people were seen to be inferior to whites. They were just cheap labor. It was exploitation completely left unchecked, and they were extremely unsafe working conditions. And the unfortunate news was no politician ever really cared. There were no reforms passed to protect these people. And a lot of Americans loved having Asians immigrants working because they were like, oh, like it's cheap, free labor. Like we don't have to do the dirty labor jobs. Like they can do it. But unfortunately, this perspective shifted when the economy began to decline, which is really unfair towards Asian immigrants. So, because the Page Act was such a turning point in American history, because it was one of the first restrictive immigration acts to be passed, it was essentially designed so that undesirable immigrants could not enter. However, undesirable isn't really defined and there's no set definition. So, the bill relied on court judges, law enforcement, and port officers to decide whether or not someone was desirable or whether or not someone was moral. But of course, since there's no strict definition, they could essentially turn away anyone that they wanted to turn away without any cause or reason. So at the end of the day, this act targeted Asian women specifically because the bill itself stated that any immigrant who was brought for lewd and immoral purposes were to be banned. And obviously, we know that the stereotype that Asian women are sexualized, and that they're all prostitutes, also played a large role in the fact that now this act, was specifically targeting Asian women. So the result of that was a lot of humiliation by immigration officers and a lot of Asian women who were being oppressed and treated unfairly. And actually, in one of the immigration ports, there were a lot of poems that were scratched into the walls by Asian women discussing the treatment that they had to endure and the abuse that they had to endure. And this act authorized federal agents at immigration ports to search and question any person from an Asian country. And so, a few examples of the poems. One reads, "With 100 kinds of oppressive laws, they mistreat us Chinese. It is still not enough after being interrogated and investigated several times. We also have to have our chests examined well naked." Another poem reads, "Imprisoned in the wooden building day after day, my freedom withheld, how can I bear to talk about it? I look to see who is happy, but they only sit quietly. I am anxious and depressed and cannot fall asleep. The days are long and the bottle constantly empty. My sad mood, even so, is not dispelled. Nights are long and the pillow cold. Who can pity my loneliness? After experiencing such loneliness and sorrow, why not just return home and learn to plow the fields?" So obviously we can see how big of an impact this act had on Asian people specifically, and how a lot of them, this kind of justified the oppression and abuse.
Yeah, and it's really terrible to see all of this oppression, and it actually brings up a pretty interesting point that Asians, were the first illegal immigrants of the United States. They required Asian women coming into the U.S. to have documents on them, and so this is really like quite a big point in U.S. history, and I mean, it's just really tough to think about Yeah, and this still applies today, especially with the stereotypes that you mentioned. There's a lot of that stereotype that's still carried along in movies in Hollywood today, and we have to fight back against it. But it's deeply rooted in U.S. history. Yeah, so I mean, like, sort of a dated example would be Anna May Wong from the 1950s. She was often given roles of sort of the evil side character who was meant to be this subductive witch, which she of course denied these roles, but she was a very talented actress who a lot of people in Hollywood ignored. But I mean, yeah, there are plenty of modern examples as well.
Yeah, and I guess like obviously in the past with like older movies and older TV shows, the it's a lot more like of a macroaggression. Like they're very more obvious
Yeah.
about their like discrimination and like how they feel towards or like the stereotypes that they
Right, yeah.
perpetuate. But in like modern day, they're more subtle. Like a lot of them are like microaggressions that like
Yeah,
a lot
I
of
mean-
people might just laugh off. Like in that Disney show at the camp, I just remember this one Asian character
Yeah.
and she was so obsessed with her violin. It actually drove me insane. Like I sat there every day like watching her kiss her violin. And I was like, damn, like this is probably why all the kids in my school ask me if I play violin.
Right. So like I do agree with you. But sometimes when in this world there's like a lot of TV shows and movies can get a really hasty. But that's the point that we're here on today is how can we stop and make sure that this never happens again, and how we make sure that we still be in the same position to keep Asians in this community. And not even if black people are trying to be racist to other white people or Asian people, but it's still wrong for them to like show that kind of like hatred to those people,
And I think it's like ironic because every time, like in that one TV show I just remember, every time they did like a microaggression or like a racist joke,
Right.
I remember the soundtrack like laugh like playing. And I think it's more normalized that like microaggressions are now just played off as like jokes. Like she wasn't only just like hugging her violin and being obsessed with it. She was also always like, oh, like if I don't win first, my mom's gonna like beat me up or something like that. And it's like also perpetuates the idea of Tiger Mom, but every time she said that, the laugh soundtrack would play. And I guess like we know now, like it wasn't very funny, and it kind of makes these stereotypes stay for longer.
Yeah, and then it also makes it harder for, I mean, it makes it harder for minorities, like, who are, in these sorts of situations. I mean, like, the Tiger Mom situation, like, if you watch a movie and you hear that this character who's just like you is, like, getting beat if, like, they don't get, like, first place in a competition, like, that makes them feel terrible. It makes them feel like they are going to get beat by their parents if they don't do well. It hurts, like, them. It hurts the people who are in these minority groups, keep suppressing them. So so to put this in perspective of American history, once the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, that was in 1869. By then, slavery had already been abolished, right? It was abolished in 1865. So an additional perspective was the fact that Asian labor could be seen as a substitute to slave labor, and this was also quite a big problem. But more importantly was sort of the fear that developed from Asian laborers taking on these extremely small wages. White American laborers began fearing for their own job security, thinking that eventually the contractors, the employers, would just take Asian labor because it was so cheap and it was so available. They could always import more Asians. And so this really begins sort of the fear of Chinese people, Chinese laborers. And this begins spreading in newspapers. There are these gruesome depictions of Chinese laborers, incredibly racist, and that sort of sows the seeds for governmental action later on in the decade. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's just like kind of a common story told in America, but a lot of the times we'll bring in like minorities to use them for a certain like task. Like in this case, it was the Transcontinental Railroad.
Right.
But then once we're done using them, all of a sudden America feels the need to expel them and like send them back
Right.
to their home countries. And we see this a lot in a lot of different scenarios with a lot of different minorities, and it always is the same story. Like, we need something from them, so we're going to use them until they're no longer of use, and then we're going to try to boot them.
Right, yeah. So that basically brings us into when the government tried to boot Chinese laborers out of the U.S., the actual passing of the Page Act in 1875. So, yeah, that was the U.S. government's attempt to basically kill off Chinese laborers, right? They thought that, so first of all, the Page Act was specifically against Asian women entering the U.S. They thought that if they restricted the entry of Chinese women into the U.S., that would mean that the Chinese laborers could not start families in the U.S., so it would really just end with that one generation of laborers that they imported, right? Because once those laborers are no longer of use, they just, the government just leaves them to die off. And, yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of you guys are probably wondering how the Page Act was even implemented, because I'm sure that, like, right now it might seem, like, horrendous or, like, really, like, something that you wouldn't think of, even though there are modern examples of, like, restrictive immigration acts that the United States has been struggling with. But just to give some more context, I'm now just going to talk about Asian stereotyping in general and the rise of anti-Asian sentiments that built up to the Page Act. So just to give some background, white immigrants like German and Irish were also arriving to America at the same time as primarily Chinese immigrants. Unfortunately, though, only Asians were seen as threats because America used to be, it used to be thought that in order to be a pure America, it would have to be a white America. Right. So they started building anti-Asian sentiments. They used religion, and they also used a lot of stereotyping. It was that Asians would carry various diseases and illnesses, like they don't shower or they're unclean. And obviously, we've seen this stereotype rise with the anti-Asian sentiments during COVID-19, or this new idea that, all Asians carry, like, dirty diseases, they're unhygienic. But the real problem was when, as you said before, immigrants began to settle, because they were like, we don't want them stealing our jobs anymore. And they were mad that Asian immigrants had, like, lower wages, or, like, that they were taking lower wages. But they weren't taking them. They were just being exploited, and there was no real laws to protect them. So it's all this kind of, like, vicious cycle where the minorities scapegoated even though they had no other options. So because of this fear of settling, that's when, like, one of the largest anti-Asian sentiments arose that kind of directly influenced the Page Act. And it was that women were sexual threats, all painted to be prostitutes coming to America purely to sin and just ruin the lives of good, hardworking Americans. Even though most of the women were proven to actually just work jobs as cooks or, like, cleaning houses. So Chinese women specifically were accused of being primary transmitters of STIs and STDs, even though both white and Asian women worked in the sex industry. So once again, we see this, like, isolation of minority. And a lot of smugglers were even hired to kidnap Chinese women and remove them from their home country to bring them to America as sex workers. So once again, we see the same theme where it's not that they were being blamed for something completely, like, out of their control.
It's like they're exploited, then blamed for the results of the exploitation. Yeah.
Pretty much. And I just think it's very, very hypocritical, the way that they were being blamed, because we'll talk about this in other podcast episodes too, but there were people who thought that, like, the white immigrants that were coming, like the German and the Irish, they were also stealing jobs. And they were like, well, maybe we should just, like, bar all immigration. But, like, barring, like, white immigrants just never got popular enough. Like, it never got any traction because there weren't enough people to back it up. But anti-Asian sentiments, there were, like, in that time period, there were probably, like, over, like, thousands of leagues of, like, anti-Asian, like, exclusions. And so it's just, like, you kind of see this, like, difference of, like, white privilege and, like, how minorities were oppressed in, like, some subtle ways, and then others were, like, not so subtle.
Right.
Really, what was the impact of all this Asian stereotyping? It was the kind of the government's like breaking point where they decided like we cannot let these Asian immigrants back in. So the very breaking point, after all these like stereotypings about being prostitutes and like sex workers, was that Chinese women were actually threatening the very institution of marriage, because all of these men who like were supporting and frequenting prostitution rings and like I guess like breaking up like their white Christian families, instead of blaming them and like punishing them for their actions, they were blaming the Chinese woman for tempting the men with sex. So once again, we see this act of like scapegoating. And this representative, Horace Page, which the act is actually named after, was very known for his anti Chinese political view, and he was the one that started ramping up support for wanting to get rid of immoral Chinese women. So, thus, we get to the Page Act of 1875. It's one of the first most restrictive immigration acts to be passed, and it was designed so that undesirable immigrants could not enter, which is obviously not a very good measurement because no one can ever measure who's undesirable or not. So it pretty much just gave power to individuals to completely change the course of another individual's life. So the bill itself relied on court judges, law enforcement, and port officers to decide whether or not a woman was a prostitute or not, which is, I'm not sure how you're going to measure that. And it pretty much just targeted Asian women specifically because, like I said before, all of the stereotyping of being sex workers, being immoral, led itself to the bill. The bill itself even said that any immigrant brought for lewd and immoral purposes had to be banned. So to give some more context around this issue, I'm going to talk a little bit about Angel Island. So it existed for around 30 years, and it processed about 500,000 immigrants from 80 different countries, and a lot of Asian immigrants, especially Chinese, immigrated through Angel Island because of its specific location. And now I'm just going to get into a little bit more about how it actually impacted the Asian woman back then. And it was just a lot of like humiliation, exploitation, and abuse. Because now that you're giving all of this power to like immigration officers and port officers, they now have the ability and the justification to abuse and exploit the Asian woman. So there were actually poems that were scratched into walls of like the treatment that they had to endure because they were subject to abuse from any officers. And it pretty much just said any person from an Asian country can be questioned and can be subject to any kind of treatment. So I have 3 poems here and the first one reads, "With 100 kinds of oppressive laws they mistreat us Chinese, it is still not enough after being interrogated and investigated several times, we also have to have our chests examined while naked." And this poem just kind of shows the irony of America because we're supposed to stand for freedom and like a new fresh start for everyone. We're supposed to be the land of this like endless opportunities, but here we can very obviously see that we're oppressing people and stopping them for reasons that were out of their own control. The second poem reads, "Imprisoned in the wooden building day after day, my freedom withheld, how can I bear to talk about it? I look to see who is happy, but they only sit quietly. I'm anxious and depressed and cannot fall asleep. The days are long and the bottle constantly empty. My sad mood, even so, is not dispelled. Nights are long and the pillow cold. Who can pity my loneliness? After experiencing such loneliness and sorrow, why not just return home and learn to plow the fields?" And unfortunately, we can kind of see that the Page Act was effective in like the goal of obviously restricting immigrants and like forcing them to not settle in America. Because like the last line, why not just return home and learn to plow the fields? People came to America for more opportunities, for a better life, but obviously we can see that America was shutting away innocent people because of harmful stereotypes. And the final poem is, "Lim, upon arriving in America, was arrested and put in the wooden building and made a prisoner. I've already been here for 1 autumn. The Americans refused me admission. I was ordered to be deported. When the news was told, I was frightened and troubled about returning to my country. We Chinese of a weak nation can only sigh at the lack of freedom," which again just shows the irony of America.
Yeah, so something else that I just want to mention is the fact that the Page Act didn't just ban Chinese women from entering the country, it banned all sorts of Asian women, such as those from Japan, India, Korea, and the Philippines. And at around the same time, the idea of anti-miscegenation or interracial marriage was also coming into play. There were bans against interracial marriage, which meant that these Asian laborers, when they came to the US, they really had no other option but to keep going back and forth from the US to their home countries to get married and to see their children, and it really prevented them from settling down and creating their own identity as Asian Americans. And this continues these anti-miscegenation interracial marriage laws continue all the way until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And this is seen with Filipino laborers in the 1960s. And these were Filipinos who were brought to the U.S. to work in grape farms. And they were old and single men, and the Filipinos actually had a term to describe these people who could not get married and were stuck working in grape farms. These people were called manongs. And so this really goes to show sort of the impact that these laws have had ever since the Page Act.
So after seeing all the irony that the United States had and how cruel they were to these immigrants, I was just curious if you ever learned about any of this in school, or if any of this was ever at least like briefly touched over.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't think any of this has ever really been touched on. When I learned about the Transcontinental Railroad, we kind of just stopped there, and I never heard about the Page Act until now, and never heard about the reasoning behind it. And I mean, it's sort of, there's a saying that like history is written by the victors, that's in reference to wartime, but really it's in reference to sort of all oppression and all of history in general. Like, we never get to hear about this type of oppression that, even though it relates very closely to our identity, and for other oppressions, for other minorities as well, none of this is spoken at all. It's very glossed over. And, we live already in a very sort of liberal state. We live in a very liberal area where education is more valued. And, I just can't imagine what it would be like in a more conservative place where it's even less, accepted to talk about this type of history.
Yeah, and I just obviously at school, especially in high school, you spend months talking about westward expansion and Manifest Destiny, and I find it just almost incredible how they can talk about westward expansion and discuss the implications of the Transcontinental Railroad and somehow still manage to skim over all of this history.
And so to me, I think it's just really crazy to see how these ideas of, banning interracial marriage, preventing Asians from coming into the U.S., these laws stuck with the U.S. for so long, all the way up until the 1960s, which we consider to be pretty modern times. And in fact, even after interracial marriage was federally made legal, Alabama still held its code banning interracial marriage sort of honorarily until the year 2000.
Yeah, so just to leave you guys here with a question today, there's a lot of subtle microaggression stereotyping that's in the modern world, and I think that's more dangerous than just outright being discriminatory sometimes, because you don't even realize that it's embedded in you. Obviously everyone has personal biases and you may not even realize you have any. So after reflecting on what you learned today with all the stereotyping, are there any reflections you could make on yourself or any personal biases that you might have that you've uncovered through this podcast, especially towards Asian immigrants, women, Asian Americans?
And so, as we conclude this episode of the Asian American Teen Podcast, I'd like you to reflect on the significance of the Page Act and its background in U.S. history, all of America's exploitations and scapegoating of Asian laborers and Asian women, and the fact that this Page Act was passed nearly 150 years ago, and we still feel the effects of its microaggressions and hidden stereotypes all across the media today. Once again, my name is Jack, my co-host is Amy, our guest speaker was Ray Sean, and this has been episode 1 of the Asian American Teen Podcast. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you for coming, and just know that by being here, you're already self-improving and becoming a leader.